Hi, everybody. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Janine Matts. I am an English and language specialist for RELO. And today we're going to continue with our series on language acquisition and look at the topic of input. As you can see, we have the title for today's webinar, The Engine of Acquisition, Input Activities in the EFL Classroom. So first, before we even start talking about the activities, we need to define input. What is input? So input can be defined as all of the language, oral and written, that the learner receives in the second language. From now on, we're going to refer to the second language as the L2, okay? We know about input since the beginning of the 1980s. There have been scientific studies now almost for more than 40 years, almost 50 years, in fact, of scientific studies on input. Okay, so in the 1980s, Dr. Steven Crashion, who is a very important name, Dr. Steven Crashion, a linguist, North American linguist, came up with the notion of comprehensible input. What is comprehensible input? Comprehensible input is the input that is able to be understood by learners. So it's not way beyond their level, right? It's more at the level that they can actually process. Throughout the years, we've done more and more research as linguists on input and the importance of input and acquisition. And now we have hundreds and hundreds of studies, scientific studies, that tell us that input is absolutely essential for acquisition. Without input, acquisition just cannot happen. In the 2020s now, Dr. Crashion took his idea of comprehensible input and built on it and developed it more and came up with the notion of what we call optimal input. Optimal input has four main characteristics. It's comprehensible, just like comprehensible input, right? It's abundant, so we need lots and lots of it. It's rich, by rich we mean rich in language, and it's compelling. In other words, it's extremely interesting for our students, right? This is not just giving them input, for example, on the American Civil War. No, this is about something that students are already very interested in. So if we think about our students, we have to think about what topics they are particularly interested in. If they're high school students, for example, they love YouTubers, influencers, things like that. So we have to give them input that's related to things that they're already very interested in, okay? I would like to share with you two quotes from two famous linguists, researchers in language acquisition. The first one, I mentioned his name already, is Dr. Steven Crashion. If you are not familiar with Dr. Steven Crashion, teachers, this is going to be your homework to look up information on Dr. Crashion and on his contributions to the field of language acquisition. He has a webpage. That is SD, as in dog, sdcrashion.com. Okay? If you go there, you will see several publications from him that are free of charge. So you can read about what he's contributed to the field, including his groundbreaking book, The Natural Approach with Tracy Terrell. This is absolutely essential for language teachers to know, because a language teacher who doesn't know about language acquisition can't possibly decide on the best methods and approaches to use in the classroom, because we need to know how the human brain works with language first in order to decide what approaches and methods go best with that natural process, right? So Dr. Crashion tells us, the best methods are therefore those that supply comprehensible input in low anxiety situations, containing messages that students really want to hear. These methods do not force early production in the second language, but allow students to produce when they are ready, recognizing that improvement comes from supplying communicative and comprehensible input and not from forcing and correcting production, right? We can all think back to our experiences as students of a foreign language, right? In many of your cases, you learned English as a foreign language. I learned Spanish as a foreign language in Chicago when I was growing up. And I remember teachers constantly correcting us, saying, no, this is wrong, say it this way, the verb has to be conjugated this way. But in reality, that's not what makes us be able to communicate in a language. Language acquisition only happens when we are processing messages. If we are not processing messages, we are not acquiring a language, okay? Another quote that is from another linguist whose name is Dr. Bill Van Patton. Dr. Bill Van Patton has also done a lot of research on this topic of language acquisition. I was fortunate enough to have him as my professor in my master's and PhD courses at the University of Illinois. He is an outstanding scholar. He has contributed a lot to the field. And he says that comprehensible input plays a fundamental role in language acquisition is not a theory that must be proven. It is a fact that needs to be explained. And the most unfortunate part of this is if we look around the world, not only in the context of Peru or in Ecuador, I'm living in Ecuador, right? Or in Ecuador or in Latin America. No, all around the world, we are still teaching languages with methodologies that existed 200 years ago. 200 years ago. And knowing what we know now from science about language acquisition, teaching with methodologies that are from 200 years ago is a big error, right? Because we know so much more now. I have a favorite poet, author, whose name is Dr. Maya Angelou. And she has a saying. She said, do the best you can until you know better. When you know better, do better. And now, thanks to linguistics and thanks to science, we know better. We know how we should teach a foreign language. But for some reason, or for a lot of reasons, we're still not listening to science. So the purpose today is to help teachers to understand the science behind language acquisition, and to be able to apply that science in the classroom, okay? Let's take a look at the difference between two terms that we talk about when we talk about input. Input as one of them, and intake. What is the difference here? So we discussed input a little bit. Input is the language that the learner receives in the L2, both spoken and written, okay? What is intake? Intake is the language that gets processed in working memory or that is retained by the learner, okay? So if we look at this from a mathematical perspective, input is always greater than intake. Our students receive more language than what is actually processed into their working memory, yeah? Okay. So how can we as teachers make more input, the input that we give them, become intake? How do we help our students to convert the input into intake? Okay, let's take a metaphor for a moment. Let's think about a sponge, okay? We think of a sponge, right? And a faucet. In the kitchen, when we have a sponge and we put it under the faucet and we open the faucet and we let the water come out, right? What happens if we open the faucet and the water comes out very fast and very hard? What happens to the sponge? The sponge is not able to absorb all of that water, right? The sponge, it's the water splashing all over the place. It's very difficult to absorb it. If we open the faucet, but not all the way, we open the faucet a little bit and we allow a trickle of water to come into the sponge is able to absorb the water better, right? Do you understand where I'm going with this? If we refine the input that we give to our students, they will be able to convert that input into intake more easily, right? And how can we do that? By using structured input activities. Okay, what do we mean by structured input activities? These are input activities that are centered around a target vocabulary set or grammar structure. Okay. Here I have some guidelines on how to create these types of activities for your students. These activities require time to create them and they require creativity. But to know that the end result of these activities will be language acquisition is worth all of the work, right? To know that our students from these activities will receive the input they need to be able to communicate in English later is rewarding enough for us, right? Okay, so here are some guidelines. Present one thing at a time. In your text, if you have new vocabulary and new grammar, We want to work with one thing at a time. We can't give them all the new vocabulary and the new grammar structure at the same time in the same activity. No, we have to work with grammar first and then vocabulary, or vice versa, right? Move from sentences to connected discourse. In other words, start with simple sentences that are all contextualized in the same context, right? But then we can move on to bigger stretches of discourse, yeah? Keep meaning in focus. This is a super important point. From now on, I'm going to ask you to promise me something, teachers, okay? From now on, I want you, every time that you're going to give your students an activity in your classroom, you're going to ask yourself this one question, okay? Does this activity require my students to process meaning? In other words, does this activity require my students to understand what the English is saying in this activity? If the answer to that question is no, then the activity goes in the garbage or the recycling bin or whatever, or you delete it, okay? We can't work with it. Why? Because it doesn't help with acquisition. It has been shown dozens of times that if we don't make students understand the meaning of what they're doing in English, then they're not acquiring the English language, okay? Use both oral and written input. That's another point that's important. Speak to them, yes, say it to them, but also let them see it written. Have the learner do something with the input. We're going to look at what I mean by do something, okay, in each one of the examples of the activities that I will show you. And keep the learner's processing strategies in mind. Think of how the students are going to be working with this input. What are they going to have the tendency to do? How are they going to process it, okay? We have, according to Bill Van Patton, we have 6 main types of input activities, which can be divided in this way: binary options, matching, supplying information, selecting alternatives, surveys, and ordering and ranking. We're going to look at an example of each one of these activities that I created for you so that you can get an idea of how they work, okay? Starting with binary options. Okay, binary we know means 2, right? Binary means 2. So these 2 options for the responses for our students can be yes, no, true, false, agree, disagree, United States, Peru, etc. Okay, whatever 2 options that you can think of, but they only have to choose between 2 options. And the purpose here is to provide students with correct input, with good input in the language, so that they can see how the structure works. They can observe how it works, right? So let's take a look at this one. The target structure I decided on here is the future with will for predictions, yeah? Let's see what it says. A fortune teller made predictions for the future. Do you agree or disagree? Okay, so in my instructions, automatically I set a context for the students, because in communicative language teaching, we always need to contextualize the language, right? It's not just random things about Johnny and Susie and Billy and who are these people and why do we care, right? Here I give them the context of a fortune teller and predictions for the future. Do you agree or disagree with her predictions? So here we see each sentence, right? I'm not going to go through every sentence and discuss it all, but what do you see here? The level of the language is understandable for the students who are learning will for predictions, right? They can understand this. They can process this language. It's simple enough. We see the target structure, will plus verb, in bold print. This is part of processing instruction. This is helping my students to realize, hello, I'm trying to teach you this structure, right? This is the important thing I want you to see. So I want to highlight the structure, put it in another color, or underline it, or whatever the case is, right? So we can do this as a class. We can have them do it in pairs. We can have them do it silently for a moment, and then we discuss as a class, however you prefer to do it, okay? All we want to know is if they agree or disagree. And by asking them if they agree or disagree, I know that the students are processing the meaning of the sentences. Because how can someone say if they agree or disagree if they don't know what the sentence means, right? So by the year 2050, cars will fly. What do I think? Do I agree or do I disagree with that? That's in like 25 years. I don't know. I disagree, right? And then you could see how many people agree, how many people disagree. remember that with input activities, we do not ask the students to produce the target structure. I cannot say to my students, okay, you give a prediction with Will. No, not yet. Why? Because first they need to form something meaningful in their implicit linguistic system here. They need to form something meaningful with the input that they're receiving, understand how the language works. So a lot of cause of stress for students is to make them produce too quickly. Many times teachers will say, here's the structure, blah, 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 blah. Now you say a sentence. And the student's like, but I just saw this 5 minutes ago. How can I possibly produce this already? And they're right. They can't, right? Look at little kids when they're acquiring their first language. What happens? They start acquiring the language and they take statistics on how it works in their little brains, right? They're not producing sentences right away. No, and it takes a long time for them to build up their implicit linguistic system so that they can use it to communicate. We allow children to have a silent period, but we don't allow students in their L2 to have a silent period. And that's not fair because they need to be able to absorb the language first before they are able to produce something meaningful with the language, okay? So that's an example of binary options. An example of supplying information. This is fill in the blank, but be careful. This does not mean fill in the blank like write the correct form of the verb, that traditional activity that does not work for language acquisition. No. Filling in the blank here means supplying information like names, colors, times, anything that the learner already knows that is not the target structure. Remember, the purpose of input activities is to teach them the target structure. We can't ask them to recognize the target structure or to produce it. No, we give it to them already correctly formed, right? So look, here the target structure is superlatives. Read each of these sentences and fill in the blank with your own opinion. So here you guys can see right away in bold print, we have the most beautiful, the most talented, the fastest, the most delicious, the funniest, right? So they're getting exposed to how the superlative works. They need to process the meaning of these sentences in order for them to respond with something that's logical. Yeah. The most beautiful place in my country is, and then they can fill in the blank. This is their opinion. So your students will have different answers. That's totally fine, right? But what they're doing is responding to the target structure. They're responding to it, but they're not producing it, right? So I could say, for example, the most beautiful place in my country in Ecuador, where I've lived for 12 years now, I would say is Quilotoa, for example. It's a lagoon, yeah? Other people can say other things, Cotopaxi, whatever, right? That's fine, as long as it makes sense. And then you can exchange ideas and everything like that, but you're not going to tell students, okay, now you write a sentence with your own superlative. Not yet, because that's output, right? We're working with input right now, yeah? So that would be an example of supplying information. If I'm working with, for example, clothing vocabulary, I can use the students in the room. I could say, the person who is wearing a black shirt, or who is wearing a black shirt, and then they think black shirt and they look around at their classmates and they say their classmate's name, yeah? So this is what we mean by supplying information, something that the learners are already capable of producing in the language, okay? Matching, we have two columns. Something happened with the alignment of my columns, but okay. So we have two columns basically, and we have to match items from column A to column B. So here the target structure I chose is the zero conditional, yeah? Think about how people behave according to the weather. Match each item in column A with the correct one in column B. So as you guys can see, once again, I have the target structure in each one of these sentences. If, and I use if and when, right? Because we can use either one for zero conditional in English. So when it is very sunny, if it rains, et cetera, and they have to match it with the other side. The language is simple enough for the students to process who are studying zero conditional, right? They have to understand the meaning of the sentences in order to connect the correct pieces with each other. So I know that they're processing meaning, right? And they're receiving the target structure, which is in this case, the zero conditional, okay? An example of selecting alternatives. Selecting alternatives is essentially the same thing as multiple choice. Yeah, multiple choice. But again, the options that we give them are not the conjugations of the verbs, and they have to choose the correct conjugation. No, that is not multiple choice here, right? What they need to choose is an option that they agree with or that makes sense, but not determining if the verb is conjugated correctly. Because remember, they are just seeing this new structure. They can't possibly determine if it's conjugated correctly or not, right? And if we do that type of activity where they choose the correct conjugation, they don't need to process meaning of anything. They just need to recognize the verb that is conjugated correctly, right? So we need to be very careful about those types of activities. So look at how we work with selecting alternatives here. My target structure is the second conditional, yeah? So imagine you are in the following situations. Which option would you choose? I only included 2 items here for the sake of time and for the sake of space. But normally for all these activities, you would do between 8 and 10 items per activity. I only did a couple because we don't have a lot of time. But let's take a look. Number 1 says, if I forgot to do a homework assignment for class, and then I could go through the options. So if I were to present this activity to my class, I want to show them the written language, and I also want them to hear it, right? So I can read this activity out loud to them, and I can ask them to vote. How many people say A? How many people say B? How many people say C? Like that, right? Or I can say, for example, Maria, what do you say? A, B, C, or D? But when I read this activity out loud, I would say, if I forgot to do a homework assignment for class, A, I would tell my teacher I left it at home. B, I would be absent to class. C, I would say that my dog ate it. Or D, I would tell my teacher the truth. Do you see what I'm doing with my voice? Where I'm emphasizing the target structure. This is also part of processing instruction. I'm helping my students to realize what it is that I want them to get from this activity, which is the second conditional, right? That's the target structure. So I'm like emphasizing it in the written form and also in the spoken form. Yeah. So that's what we have. Number 2, the same thing. If my friends and I found a dying bird on the sidewalk, A, we would take it to a vet. B, we would take it home. C, we wouldn't touch it. And D, we would call an adult to help. Yeah. So they can choose which option is more likely for them. And then we would have question 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and think of other scenarios and do the same thing. Highlight the target structure, make sure the language is at the level of the learners that are working with the activity, make sure that they are processing meaning all the time, that they have to understand the English in order to do the activity, etc. Okay? Surveys. The purpose of surveys is for students to give their opinion on an appropriate topic. Why do I say appropriate topic? Because we have to take into consideration the age of our students, right? We can't ask, for example, students who are 7 and 8 years old to give their opinions on the sentences that I have here on the screen, because they are not capable of processing these ideas, right? But we can have students who are 7 and 8 years old give their opinions on fruits and vegetables, right? If I'm teaching fruits and vegetables, I can do a survey with my students using emojis, using faces, a smiley face if they really like it, a straight face if they're neutral, and a sad face if they don't like it. And I could put the names of the fruits and vegetables, apple, pear, banana, broccoli, et cetera, and they can select their opinion, right? So it really depends on the age of the students. But in this case, we're working with the modal verb should. Yeah, that's our target structure. Read each of these sentences and decide how much you agree with each one. And I give them a scale. This is a Likert scale, right? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. So they have to determine their own opinion about each one of these affirmations. Yeah. Number 1, and again, I can read these out loud. I can see how many people say 5, strongly agree, 4, etc. Yeah. The government should do more to help poor people. How many of you say 5? How many say 4, right? Etc. Everyone in my country should learn English, and then they can give their opinion. Now, If students want to explain why they feel that way, you can let them speak. If they want to contribute something extra, that's okay. They can explain how they feel if they have the linguistic competence to do it. But what we can't do is tell the students right away, okay, now you write a sentence with should. Not yet. We have to give them enough input first before they can produce something meaningful with should. Okay? So this is an example of what we could use as a survey. Ordering and ranking. Ordering means putting in chronological order, or ranking, which is putting in order of preference. What do I prefer first, second, third, fourth, etc., right? So here we could be working with the simple past irregular verbs. And I give them the context of the Simpsons family, because the Simpsons are like 30 years old, if not more at this point, and they are still popular. So with some students, The Simpsons resonates with them. They understand The Simpsons, they're familiar with The Simpsons. So I said, Bart Simpson had a busy day yesterday. Put the events in the correct order. So as you can see, each one of the events is simple English that students with this level of English can understand, that each one includes an irregular verb in the past in English. And the students have to read the sentences, understand the meaning, right? And put them in the correct logical order of how they probably happened yesterday for Bart Simpson, right? So again, students are processing meaning, they're exposed to the target structure, but they're not producing it yet. And they're reacting to the target structure, which means they're putting these events in order. You see how each one of these activities that I have presented to you so far shows that students react to the target structure, either by saying yes, no, or by putting the name of a place, or by putting things in order, or by saying their opinion, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? This is what we mean by students reacting to the input, doing something with the input, because then we have the guarantee that the students are processing meaning. And guess what happens? When they process meaning, we have a psycholinguistic process that happens in our brains that's called binding. Binding is a concept that was developed by Tracy Terrell. And this is the combination of form and meaning. What do we mean by form? Form means how is the grammar structure formed? For example, if I'm talking about the present continuous, it's to be plus ing. Great, that's form. Meaning is when we know that the students are actually understanding the English. What is the message communicating? Yeah, and that's a lot of times what we miss in traditional classrooms. We focus so much on form and so much on accuracy and conjugate this verb correctly and know this is the wrong order, and you forgot about the ED, or you forgot about the third person singular S. And then we completely forget that the whole point of learning a language is to be able to use the language to communicate, right? And if we don't have students go through the psycholinguistic process of binding, of connecting form and meaning together, we're not doing them any good. And that's how we end up with students at the end of 10 years of studying English who say, I can conjugate the verb to be, that's it. Or I can tell you all the irregular simple past in English, that's it. In large part, it's because of the methodologies that are still being used around the world. Like I said, this is around the world, not just in Latin America, everywhere. I work with the Peace Corps, the United States Peace Corps in Quito. Here in Quito, I do seminars with them and things like that. And I was talking to a few North Americans the other day when I was at the Peace Corps, and I said, how were your Spanish classes in high school? And they told me that they're being taught still in the same way. Here's the verb conjugation, conjugate all these forms, now fill in the blanks with the verbs, still, in the context of the United States, right? So this is a worldwide phenomenon that we need to start changing from our little corner of the world, right? Guess what happens? After you do all these input activities, a really cool thing happens, a really magical thing. And that is that actually the students can tell you the grammar rule, right? So if I do a lot of input activities like the ones I presented using the present continuous, okay? Using the present continuous, I say, a lot is happening at school today. The students are eating lunch now. The birds are singing in the playground. The sun is shining, like all this stuff, right? And I do a few input activities. Instead of me presenting the rule to the students, I say, guys, what did you notice from what we've just done? And the students will say, teacher, the verb to be plus verb ing. Good, that's right. Yes. Okay. And when are we talking about? Yesterday? No, teacher. Tomorrow? No, teacher. Now. Okay, so what is the rule for English? And the students will say, teacher, you need to be plus ing to say something is happening now. That's right. They got it. They figured out the rule. Not you. You didn't tell them. They figured it out. And this is good because this is how language acquisition naturally works, because in our brains as native speakers, we figure out the rule ourselves. Nobody tells us rules, right, for our native language. And this empowers your students. So the students feel like they're really, like I was able to teach my teacher. This is so cool. I know the rule. I figured it out myself. And this is really good for their affective filters to lower them, right? If you didn't hear about the affective filter, you can take a look at the recording from last month's webinar where we talk about the affective filter, but it lowers anxiety for them. It makes them feel powerful. So it's really great to start with input activities. So in conclusion, input is the first thing we should give our students when introducing them to a new target grammar structure or vocabulary set. Instead of giving them the rule for the conjugation, instead of making them fill in blanks or produce sentences, the first thing we need to do is start with input, with comprehensible input and structured input activities, so that the students receive the language. They receive it and they can build something in their linguistic system with the comprehensible input, okay? So it's very important that we start with that. If you have a class that's 5 days a week, let's say 1 hour each day, and you have 1 week to teach them a new structure, past perfect, for example. Personally, I would take the first 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and only use input activities with them. Let them build their linguistic system with the new form that you're showing them. Only use input activities like the ones I presented. Then on Thursday, try to start getting them to produce the form, the structure, but not before then. Not before then. We are always in a hurry to make students produce the structure before they have the adequate representation in their linguistic system to be able to produce something meaningful in that structure. And in next month's webinar, we're going to take a look at output activities and how we can have our students do something besides filling in blanks, besides choosing correct forms, how we can have our students do something with producing the language that is actually meaningful and will help in their communication in English. So thank you very much for joining us in today's webinar. It's been a pleasure to share time together. I really hope that you guys have learned something new and something that you feel that you can apply in your classroom, that you can work with. Put a line in there in the chat, talk to us, tell us how you've applied these new things in your classroom, tell us how they work for you, let us know how this plays out in your classroom. And don't forget to join me, please, in the Zoom session that follows in about 25 minutes for a follow-up discussion on the topic. If you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, I'd love to meet up with you. So join me in the Zoom session. You can find the Zoom link on the RELO Andes Facebook page right now. So I would be happy to meet up with you there. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.